Hi, I'm Claire, and this is Podcast Recommendations Part 2. This is the second episode of a little mini-series here on my channel, and it does basically what it says on the tin. I talk about some podcasts that I really enjoy listening to, and that I think everyone should check out. In episode 1, I talked about 4 of my favorite podcasts, so if you haven't seen it, I'll leave a link in the description box below or a card somewhere on screen. And without further ado, we're going to talk about 4 more favorite podcasts of mine. First, I want to talk about Reading the End, a delightful bookish podcast that is hosted by the demographically similar Jennies. So we have Gin Jenny and Whiskey Jenny who host the podcast most of the time. They also have guests from time to time. It's mostly just the two of them, and they talk about what they've been reading and about bookish and literary news and happenings. Of course, like a lot of the bookish podcasts that I listen to, I enjoy it because I really enjoy the Jenny's perspectives on the books that they read and on literature in general and the bookish world, but also they read much more widely than I do. They read a lot of mainstream and literary stuff that I'm not necessarily all that interested in, as evidenced by the fact that I have a podcast that is specifically about nothing but genre books myself. But I like having a little bit of an awareness and an overview of what's going on in the kind of wider mainstream literary bookish community. For me, the only slight drawback of this podcast is that I sometimes get a bit confused as to who it is that's currently speaking, because I find Gin Jenny and Whiskey Jenny have fairly similar voices, but I don't know if that's just me, and if you're more familiar with American accents or maybe a native speaker of English, then that doesn't apply as much. Next is another bookish podcast, but this one is more about the publishing industry in general. It is called Shipping and Handling, and it is hosted by Bridget Smith and Jennifer Udden, who are both literary agents in New York. Now, because Bridget and Jen are both very busy being literary agents, this show is a little bit more irregular in its release schedule than some of the other shows I've mentioned. However, it is still absolutely worth the wait for me because they have such great insights into the publishing industry. This is a podcast that I started listening to when I was writing fiction more regularly, with kind of a view to submit to literary agents in future, but I still find it like really worthwhile now that I've kind of slowed down on that front a little bit, because it can sometimes appear from the outside to readers and reviewers as if the ways of the publishing industry are so arcane, but actually there are a lot of resources that you can go to if you want to see how things work from the inside. Bridget and Jen are so dedicated to what they do, they're so passionate about books and stories, and they kind of show you a bit more of a like person side of how the industry works, and they also usually have wine while they record the podcast, so it all ends up being in good fun and in good cheer. Next, we're going to veer away from books a little bit and talk about Sawbones. This is a podcast about medical history that is hosted by Sydney McElroy, who is a general practitioner, a family doctor in the US, and her husband Justin McElroy, who is very funny on a lot of various podcasts and also the internet at large. Each episode they look at a specific medical topic. Sydney will have research in advance, and then we'll talk Justin through how the topic was originally perceived in history, and Justin will ask questions. They just generally talk about what was done medically to try and solve this issue, and then there is usually a little bit at the end about what it is that we know now about the specific illness and how we currently now treat it in the 21st century. I really love this show, partly because I love weird medical facts and medical history in general. I find that to be a fascinating subject, but also because Justin and Sydney managed to strike this great balance between humor and seriousness in the show. I mean, obviously we are talking about ailments that have in many cases killed a lot of people, and it's not necessarily something that it's easy to laugh at, but at the same time we have in the past tried some ludicrous things in the name of medicine. And finally, for my last recommendation of this episode, I'm going to tell you about The Boy Who Hasn't Lived, which is a relatively new Harry Potter podcast that I'm really enjoying. The Boy Who Hasn't Lived is hosted by CJ and Arlie. CJ is reading through the Harry Potter series for the first time, whilst Arlie is a bit of a super fan and he's read the books many times. What I love about this show is that CJ and Arlie both come to the series with very different experiences from one another, but also very different experiences from my own experience with the series and the fandom and the phenomenon that Harry Potter is and was. In the first episode of the show, they talk about their experiences and their background and how come CJ hasn't read Harry Potter yet, even though they really enjoy reading in general. And then they talk about each book as they read through them. They will start with asking CJ what they think's gonna happen during the book based just on the title and what they've absorbed by osmosis from the culture around them, and then they read through the books and they do episodes that are like a chunk of chapters from book one. I think they did 3 episodes for book one and then they did an episode for the movie. That's where they're at now. It's still a very young podcast, but I'm really enjoying it and I would really highly recommend it, if only for like the sympathy cringe that you get when Arlie has to keep a tight lead on the spoilers and try not to say things, because CJ will often say things that are very prescient in terms of what happens later in the books, and you kind of sit there and go, I could not keep my mouth shut on that one. So that's it. Those were 4 more of my favorite podcasts. I hope you'll try and give them a listen, and please let me know in the comments below if you've got any podcast recommendations for me based on the things that I've talked about in this episode. If you'd like to see more from me, you can check out a previous video right here, and if you haven't yet, please hit that subscribe button that is on my face over here for more videos from me every week. I've been Claire, thanks so much for watching, and see you soon.